You think you know the person sleeping next to you until the mask slips and you are staring into the eyes of a stranger. For 8 years, I built a $1 billion empire with a man who repaid my loyalty by stabbing me in the back with my own sister. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They mistook my silence for weakness, never realizing I was already drafting the blueprints for their absolute destruction. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for your continued love and support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to continue operations, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and transition our efforts to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear exclusive, true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and filled with detailed situations we simply cannot publish on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive into today's tale of betrayal and calculated retribution, seen through the eyes of our protagonist, Brianna Matthews. The dining room of my parents' Gold Coast estate always felt less like a home and more like a museum curated for the sole purpose of intimidating its guests. Heavy velvet drapes suffocated the tall windows, and the chandelier overhead cast a sterile, unforgiving light on the imported Carrara marble table. I sat rigidly in my high-backed chair, tracing the rim of my crystal wine glass. I was 33 years old, the lead architect at Lumina Design Group, and by any objective measure, a highly successful woman, yet, in the house of Marcus and Eleanor, I was little more than a ghost haunting the periphery of their grand societal ambitions. Across the table sat the sun around which my parents orbit, my 29-year-old sister, Chloe. She was a lifestyle influencer, a woman whose greatest achievement was curating a perfectly filtered existence for strangers on the internet. Tonight, she wore a silk slip dress that cost more than my first car, her manicured fingers constantly adjusting her hair to catch the light. My parents hung on her every vapid word, their eyes glowing with an adoration they had never once directed toward me or my architectural awards. And then there was my husband, Derek, the arrogant, ruthlessly ambitious Chief Executive Officer of Apex Horizon Development. He sat next to me, but the emotional chasm between us could have swallowed a city block. For the past 6 months, he had been a phantom in our own home, always working late, always distracted. He blamed the grueling schedule of acquiring the waterfront land for our upcoming Crown Jewel project, a multi-million-dollar endeavor we were supposed to build together. But my mind was trained to spot structural weaknesses. I noticed the way he guarded his phone, the subtle shift in his cologne, the hollow, rehearsed tone of his apologies. I knew something was fracturing beneath our foundation, but I had no idea how deep the rot truly went. The suffocating tension in the room finally snapped during dessert, as the maid placed delicate gold-rimmed plates of crème brûlée in front of us. Chloe dramatically cleared her throat. The silver spoon in her hand clinked sharply against her glass. "I have an announcement," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet theatricality. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a small, glossy square of paper with a smug, deliberate motion. She slid the ultrasound photo across the pristine marble table. It stopped precisely in the center, directly under the glare of the chandelier. For a brief, naive second, I thought she was announcing a pregnancy with some random flavor-of-the-month boyfriend. But the air in the room suddenly turned to ice as Derek leaned forward. He did not look at me. Instead, he reached across the table and tightly gripped Chloe's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a sickening display of intimacy. "Chloe and I are having twins," Derek declared, his voice echoing in the cavernous dining room with a terrifying sense of pride. Time stopped. The world around me dissolved into a ringing silence. My husband, my sister, my life, detonated with 7 simple words. I braced myself for the explosion of parental outrage. I waited for my father, Marcus, to stand up and throw Derek out of the house for destroying his eldest daughter's marriage. I waited for my mother, Eleanor, to scream at Chloe for committing the ultimate familial betrayal. Instead, Marcus let out a booming laugh, his face flushing with absolute delight, while Eleanor clasped her hands together in ecstatic joy. They erupted into joyous applause. "Oh, darling, this is magnificent news," Eleanor squealed, rushing over to embrace Chloe. I sat frozen, the breath knocked completely out of my lungs. "Are you out of your minds?" I whispered, my voice barely cutting through their repulsive celebration. "He is my husband." My father looked at me, his expression hardening into cold, pragmatic stone. "Oh, Brianna, do not be so dramatic," Marcus sneered, waving his hand dismissively. "You and Derek have been struggling for years. A man of his immense wealth and standing deserves a fertile legacy. You could not provide that for him. Chloe can. You should be happy the empire is staying within the family." The cruelty of his words twisted like a serrated knife in my chest. My years of unexplained childlessness, the silent agony I had endured in sterile clinic waiting rooms, were now being weaponized against me by my own flesh and blood to justify this grotesque betrayal. Derek and Chloe looked at me with smug, breathless anticipation. I saw it in their eyes. They wanted the hysterical meltdown. They wanted me to scream, to flip the table, to dissolve into a pathetic puddle of tears so they could justify writing me off as the crazy, unstable ex-wife. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. I am an architect. When a skyscraper's load-bearing columns are structurally compromised, you do not stand inside and scream at the falling concrete. You evacuate the premises, you assess the catastrophic failure, and you prepare for the demolition. The volatile, burning emotions rising in my throat were instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. I completely shut off my heart. I reached for my linen napkin, calmly dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my untouched dessert. "Congratulations to you both," I said, my voice as smooth and emotionless as polished glass. I stood up, pushing my chair back without making a sound. I did not look back as I walked out of the dining room, retrieved my wool coat, and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind whipped across my face, but I felt nothing. Derek and Chloe thought they had won. They thought they had buried me. But as I walked down the icy driveway, my mind was already racing, drafting the precise, ruthless blueprints for their absolute destruction. Within exactly 48 hours of walking out of that dining room, I retained the services of Robert Vance, widely known as the most ruthless corporate litigation attorney in the state of Illinois. Robert was not a man who engaged in polite negotiation. He was a legal butcher who specialized in dissecting high-net-worth marriages with surgical, uncompromising precision. I instructed him to expedite the divorce filings with maximum aggression, ensuring the papers were humiliatingly served to Derek right in the middle of a crowded board meeting at his corporate headquarters. Exactly 2 weeks later, the battle lines were drawn. We met in Robert's sleek, glass-walled conference room located on the 54th floor of a towering downtown high-rise. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a bleak, overcast gray, perfectly matching the sterile, unfeeling atmosphere of the impending legal execution. The heavy frosted glass doors swung open, and Derek strutted into the room, projecting the unbearable aura of a conquering emperor. Clinging tightly to his arm was Chloe. She was wearing a loose, beige cashmere sweater, intentionally styled to accentuate the barely visible bump of her pregnancy, playing the role of the delicate, expectant mother. Derek did not even have the basic human decency to look ashamed as he took his seat across the long, polished mahogany table, flanked by 3 highly paid, nervous-looking attorneys. He immediately launched his offensive. His primary target was obvious from the moment he opened his mouth. He aggressively demanded full and undisputed ownership of the Onyx River project. Onyx River was not just a piece of land. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar luxury waterfront development that was poised to redefine the city skyline. It was my masterpiece. I had spent 3 grueling years meticulously drafting the intricate blueprints, managing the exhaustive topographical surveys, and fighting tooth and nail with the city council to secure the complex zoning permits. Derek's firm was merely the financial vehicle meant to fund the construction, but now, he wanted the entire kingdom for himself. He wanted the prestige, the projected billion-dollar return on investment, and the architectural glory that belonged entirely to my intellect and labor. "It is simple business, Brianna," Derek sneered, leaning back in his expensive leather chair and crossing his arms over his chest. "You are a machine, a cold, career-obsessed machine. You have Lumina Design Group. You have your little design awards. But Onyx River requires a visionary developer to see it through to the bitter end, not just a drafter who sits behind a desk." Beside him, Chloe placed a delicate, manicured hand over her stomach and let out a soft, highly rehearsed sigh. "Please, Brianna," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous, manufactured pity. "Just hand over the assets. Do not drag this out in court and make it ugly. Derek needs to provide for his real family now. The twins are going to need a highly secure future, and you have no one but yourself to care for anyway." I looked at my sister, taking in her pathetic, theatrical performance. She truly believed she was the absolute victor in this room. She thought she was watching me lose everything. Robert Vance tensed beside me, his jaw clenching as he fully prepared to unleash a legal bloodbath over the asset division. The Onyx River development represented a massive fortune in future revenue, and Derek's lead counsel braced their shoulders for the inevitable, brutal counteroffer, instead of fighting. I placed my hands flat on the cool glass surface of the table, looked directly into Derek's arrogant eyes, and feigned complete and utter defeat. "Fine," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a broken whisper, playing the part of the exhausted, deeply wounded wife to absolute perfection. "You can have it." A stunning, heavy silence fell over the massive conference room. Derek's attorneys exchanged highly bewildered glances. Even Derek looked momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, unearned ease of his victory. "I will sign over 100% of my equity in the Onyx River project," I continued, keeping my posture slightly slumped to sell the illusion of surrender. "I will walk away from the development entirely. I will only keep my personal firm, Lumina Design Group, and my private savings accounts. You get the waterfront development. Derek, every single inch of it." Derek's chest puffed out with a triumphant, predatory breath. A greedy smile stretched across his face. But before his lawyers could officially finalize the victory and draft the transfer, I raised a single, steady finger. "However," I stated, my tone shifting instantly to something significantly more rigid and legally absolute. "If I am giving up my life's work and my greatest professional achievement, I completely refuse to be tied to it in any capacity moving forward. I absolutely insist on a standard clean break clause being integrated immediately into the final settlement." Derek's lead attorney frowned, furiously flipping through his yellow legal pad. "Define your terms for this clause," the lawyer muttered suspiciously. "It is quite simple," I replied, maintaining a deadpan expression. "By taking sole and undisputed ownership of the project, Derek immediately and irrevocably assumes all current and future liabilities attached to the land. That explicitly includes all environmental liabilities, all pending construction debts, and any municipal burdens. I walk away with absolutely nothing from the project, but I walk away completely clean." It was a standard legal maneuver in corporate asset division. Derek's lawyers recognized it as a routine, boilerplate stipulation when one partner exits a joint venture. However, their lead counsel, a highly cautious man with graying temples, hesitated. He leaned toward Derek and whispered a sharp, urgent warning. "Mr. Matthews, I highly advise we take a few days to thoroughly review the project appendices and the updated environmental land surveys before signing this specific clause. We need to know exactly what liabilities exist on that property." But Derek was completely blinded by his insatiable greed, the intoxicating thrill of believing he had just swindled his ex-wife out of a billion-dollar empire, coupled with his desperate, arrogant urge to officially begin his wealthy new life with Chloe, entirely overrode whatever minimal business sense he possessed. He looked at me with pure disdain, viewing my demand as the final, desperate gasp of a defeated woman. "Do not be a coward, Richard," Derek snapped at his senior lawyer, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls with supreme irritation. "She is just trying to make it sound complicated with legal jargon, so she feels like she won something today. The land is prime real estate. Give me the damn pen." Derek aggressively snatched a heavy silver fountain pen from the center of the table. Without reading a single page of the dense, highly technical appendices I had carefully arranged at the very back of the contract, he eagerly signed his name on the dotted line. He pressed so hard, the dark ink bled straight through the thick parchment paper. He signed away his rights to any future claims against me, firmly locking himself into sole responsibility for the property. As I sat quietly and watched him hand the signed, legally binding documents over to the public notary, a tiny, imperceptible smile finally grazed my lips. Derek firmly believed he had just stolen my kingdom. He had absolutely no idea that he had just legally chained his own neck to a catastrophic financial graveyard. I did not need to be present in the room to know exactly how his victory lap played out. Margaret, his stern and fiercely principled mother, would later recount every agonizing detail to me with tears of bitter shame in her eyes. While I was stepping into the elevator of that downtown high-rise, breathing the clean air of my newly reclaimed freedom, Derek was speeding his obnoxious luxury sports car toward Margaret's elegant Gold Coast townhouse. He was overflowing with a toxic hubris, his mind drunk on the delusion of his own brilliance. He was desperate to show off his perceived triumphs to the one woman whose approval he had never been able to buy. Margaret was a woman of old money restraint. She despised Derek's flashy tech bro persona, the loud cars, the cheap corporate arrogance, and his constant need to broadcast his wealth. She preferred the quiet dignity of genuine substance. Over the years, Margaret and I had developed a silent, profound understanding. She saw the immense effort I put into my career and my marriage, and she respected me for it. Derek burst through the heavy mahogany doors of her townhouse without knocking, projecting the energy of the gladiator returning from the Colosseum. Margaret was sitting in her opulent reading room, bathed in the soft afternoon light, holding an antique crystal glass of sparkling water. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound books, creating an atmosphere of quiet reflection that Derek was about to violently shatter. She looked up from her armchair, visibly displeased by his sudden chaotic intrusion. Derek paced across the priceless Persian rug, unable to contain his manic energy. "It is done," Derek proudly announced to her, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of dominance. "I just legally divorced Brianna, and I completely outsmarted her in the settlement. I stripped her of her greatest architectural project. I own Onyx River now. Everything she worked for is mine. But that is not even the best part. Mother." He stopped pacing and leaned forward, expecting to finally win the maternal admiration he had chased his entire life. "I am finally giving you the family legacy you truly deserve. Chloe is pregnant. We are having twins." Derek stood there with a massive, arrogant grin, waiting for a warm embrace. He expected his mother to weep with joy, to finally validate his ruthless choices. Instead, the color entirely drained from Margaret's face, leaving her looking like a hollowed-out porcelain doll. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. Her fingers began to tremble violently. The antique crystal glass slipped from her weakened grip. It struck the hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged, glittering pieces. The sharp, explosive noise echoed through the silent reading room like a gunshot, freezing the triumphant grin right on Derek's face. "Mother?" Derek asked, his voice wavering with sudden confusion. "What is wrong with you?" Margaret stared at her son, her chest heaving as she choked back a suffocating sob. She did not look at him with pride. She looked at him with profound pity and horrific dread. "You arrogant, foolish boy," she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of a devastating reality. "That is biologically impossible." Derek scoffed, defensively crossing his arms. "What are you talking about?" Chloe showed me the ultrasound right at the dinner table. Margaret slowly stood up from her armchair, her legs shaking so terribly she had to brace her hand against the side table. When you were 16 years old, Derek, you were diagnosed with a highly aggressive, rare tumor. Your father and I were terrified. The doctors told us there was only one way to save your life. You had to undergo an emergency bilateral orchiectomy. Derek froze. The blood violently rushed out of his face. He remembered the surgery, of course, but the extreme trauma of his youth had always been shrouded in vague medical terms his highly protective parents had used to shield him from the harsh reality of the operation. You have worn medical prosthetics since you were a teenager, Margaret said, the tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks, dripping down onto her silk blouse. You are 100% permanently, biologically sterile. You cannot father children. Derek, you never could. The realization hit Derek like a massive freight train crashing into a concrete wall. His breathing became erratic, his mind desperately trying to reject the truth. But Margaret was not finished destroying his ego. She stepped closer to him, her voice turning into a sharp, unforgiving blade. "Do you want to know who else knew the truth?" Margaret demanded. "Brianna. She discovered your hidden oncology records 5 years ago." Derek staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing in silent, hyperventilating shock. "She came to me in tears, absolutely terrified for your pride." Margaret continued, her tone laced with absolute disgust for her own son. "To protect your severely fragile masculinity, Brianna swore to keep the medical secret. For 5 entire years, she sat in silence while you hurled cruel, unforgivable insults at her. She let you call her barren to her face. She let you blame her for your empty house, absorbing every single ounce of your abuse, because she loved you enough to carry your shame for you." The world began to violently spin around Derek. The grand illusions of his alpha male dominance, his fertile legacy, his ultimate triumph over me, all evaporated into thin air in an instant. He had just brutally discarded a fiercely loyal wife who had protected his deepest, darkest insecurities with unwavering grace, and he had traded her for a sister-in-law who had orchestrated a sociopathic, massive deception just to trap him for his wealth. Chloe's twins belonged to another man. The grand family legacy was a complete, fabricated lie. In a matter of seconds, the arrogant king had been reduced to a pathetic, sterile pawn in a game he did not even realize he was playing. Staring down at the shattered crystal on the floor, knowing his life was broken beyond repair, blinded by a toxic cocktail of rage and profound betrayal, Derek tore out of his mother's driveway. The tires of his sports car shrieked against the pavement as he sped toward the steel and glass fortress of Apex Horizon Development Headquarters. His mind was a chaotic storm of furious calculations. Chloe had played him. She had looked at his immense wealth and seen nothing but an unlimited bank account to fund her lavish influencer lifestyle, using another man's children as the ultimate snare. His immediate priority was to cut her off entirely, to freeze his personal assets before she could drain a single cent. He stormed past his terrified assistants, slamming the heavy mahogany door of his executive suite behind him. He threw himself into his leather chair and violently woke up his computer monitors, his fingers hammering across the keyboard to access the executive dashboard. He needed to lock down the Onyx River project, the billion-dollar prize he had bled his marriage dry to steal. But when the screens flickered to life, there was no victory lap waiting for him. Instead, his dashboard was a blinding sea of flashing red indicators. Internal financial alarms were blaring through the encrypted server. Apex Horizon's stock was in a free fall, plummeting by over 30% in less than 2 hours. His chief financial officer had left exactly 14 frantic voicemails. Derek's heart hammered furiously against his ribs as he clicked into the urgent notifications. There, sitting at the top of his inbox, was a massive, heavily encrypted file from the Environmental Protection Agency. Derek's eyes darted across the digital documents, his breath turning shallow as he frantically scanned the dense, bureaucratic text. The devastating truth I had meticulously hidden deep within the complex architectural and topographical surveys was finally unearthing itself. 3 months before the divorce, during my routine, subsurface soil evaluations, my engineering team had hit something catastrophic. We discovered that the pristine waterfront land of the Onyx River project was situated directly over a classified, highly volatile industrial chemical dump dating back to the 1970s. The soil was completely saturated with lethal heavy metals and toxic sludge, and the federal government had just officially flagged the entire 300 acres of property as a Level 1 EPA Superfund site. Derek's hands began to shake violently as he opened the attached legal mandate. A massive, federally mandated environmental cleanup was ordered, effective immediately. The estimated cost for soil remediation and toxic waste removal was not a mere slap on the wrist. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his throat. He frantically dialed his lead corporate counsel, Richard. "We need to dump this land right now." Derek screamed into the phone the second the lawyer answered, completely abandoning his usual polished demeanor. "Declare corporate bankruptcy. Transfer the liability back to Brianna. She designed the site. She ran the surveys. Blame her firm." "I cannot do that." "Derek," Richard's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding utterly exhausted and defeated. "Did you completely forget the binding settlement you signed 48 hours ago?" "What are you talking about?" Derek snapped, his pulse roaring in his ears. "The clean break clause," Richard replied, delivering the final, fatal blow. "You demanded full, undisputed ownership. You explicitly signed away your right to pursue Brianna for any hidden liabilities, because of the exact wording she insisted on. She legally isolated herself and her firm completely. She walked away with clean hands. By signing those appendices, you refused to read. You personally and irrevocably assumed all environmental liabilities, all construction debts, and all municipal burdens." Derek stared blankly at the glowing monitors, the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic failure sinking in. "The federal government does not care about your corporate shields. Derek," Richard continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "This is an EPA mandate. They are piercing the corporate veil. You are personally on the hook for a federal fine exceeding $400 million. Apex Horizon is instantly bankrupt. Your corporate accounts are completely frozen by the federal treasury, and the bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings on your personal estate to cover the pending collateral loss. You have absolutely nothing left." The line went dead. Derek dropped the phone, his world collapsing into a suffocating, inescapable black hole. The billion-dollar empire he thought he had stolen was actually a toxic grave I had carefully dug for him. I had not surrendered the Onyx River project. I had handed him a live grenade, pulled the pin, and walked out the door while he arrogantly smiled. Desperation clawed at his chest. He grabbed his phone again, his fingers slipping on the glass screen as he frantically searched for my contact name. He hit the call button, ready to beg, ready to offer anything, ready to crawl on his hands and knees to renegotiate the settlement and ask for my help to untangle the legal web I had spun. He pressed the phone tightly to his ear, his breathing ragged and erratic. "The number you have dialed is currently disconnected and is no longer in service," the automated voice replied, its robotic tone echoing loudly in the dead silence of his rapidly decaying executive suite. I was gone. I had completely vanished into the digital wind, a ghost who had meticulously orchestrated his total financial annihilation. Derek sat alone in the dark, suffocating under the crushing, toxic ruins of his own insatiable greed, finally realizing that the woman he thought was a cold machine was actually the architect of his absolute ruin. Derek's catastrophic financial implosion sent immediate, violent shockwaves through the parasitic ecosystem that had fed so greedily on his wealth. Chloe was the first to feel the crushing impact. She had walked into an exclusive designer baby boutique downtown, ready to purchase thousands of dollars in imported nursery furniture to maintain her online facade. When she swiped her platinum card, the machine screamed with a harsh red decline notice. She frantically tried 3 more cards. All of them declined. When she desperately drove to Derek's estate to demand an explanation, armed security guards physically barred her from the iron gates. They coldly informed her that all assets were under federal lockdown, and Derek had explicitly ordered them to keep her off the property permanently. The gravy train had spectacularly derailed, leaving her stranded without a single dollar to her name. But for my parents, Marcus and Eleanor. Derek's sudden bankruptcy was not just a humiliating social embarrassment. It was a literal, terrifying death sentence. For over a decade, their lavish Gold Coast lifestyle, the exclusive country club memberships, the endless European vacations, and the charity galas had been a complete and total mirage. To maintain the fragile illusion of generational wealth, they had quietly borrowed a massive fortune from a highly dangerous, violent private lending syndicate operating in the shadows of Chicago's criminal underworld. The interest rates were predatory, and the collectors were known to break bones before they asked questions. Marcus and Eleanor had been relying entirely on Derek's billion-dollar development deal to quietly bail them out before the syndicate's enforcers came knocking. Now, with Derek financially radioactive, the ruthless loan sharks were circling their pristine estate, demanding immediate repayment. Desperation makes arrogant people incredibly stupid, cornered, terrified, and facing violent ruin. The three of them reverted to their oldest, most reliable survival tactic. They decided to bully the quiet, compliant daughter. They assumed I was still the invisible ghost from the family dinner table, a weak woman they could easily manipulate and guilt-trip into emptying her private savings to rescue them from the fire they had started themselves. They ambushed the downtown headquarters of Lumina Design Group right before the busy lunch hour. They stormed through the revolving glass doors, marching past the marble reception desk with the entitled, "Blind Fury of Minor Royalty." "I demand to see Brianna Matthews immediately," Marcus bellowed at the terrified young receptionist, his face flushed with panicked rage. "Tell her that her father is here, and we are not leaving until she comes down here and fixes this mess." He fully expected me to be huddled in some middle management cubicle, eager to rush down to the lobby and beg for his approval. Instead, two towering, broad-shouldered members of my elite private security team materialized from the shadows of the lobby. They did not ask my family to leave. Under my strict prior instructions, the guards flanked my parents and sister in suffocating silence and escorted them into a private, key-card-secured express elevator. The heavy steel doors closed, and the carriage rocketed up 50 floors without stopping. When the metallic doors slid open, Marcus, Eleanor, and Chloe stepped out, and their entitled fury instantly evaporated into stunned, breathless awe. They did not step into a cubicle. They stepped into a breathtaking, multi-million-dollar penthouse executive suite. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the entire Chicago skyline, the very city I was helping to build. Museum-quality contemporary art adorned the pristine white walls. The sheer magnitude of the wealth and power radiating from the room completely paralyzed them. I was seated behind a massive slab of imported black onyx that served as my desk, calmly reviewing architectural blueprints. I did not bother to stand up to greet them. "Brianna," Eleanor finally stammered, her eyes darting nervously around the cavernous, silent suite. "What is all of this? How do you possibly have this office?" I slowly closed my leather portfolio, letting the heavy silence stretch until it became physically painful for them. "You look terribly tired, Mother," I noted, my voice echoing with a chilling, untouchable calm that made them all take a step back. Marcus slammed his fist on the edge of my onyx desk, desperately trying to reclaim his shattered patriarchal authority. "Enough of these ridiculous games. Brianna, Derek is ruined. We are facing a severe temporary liquidity crisis. We need you to liquidate your private savings and transfer $5 million to my account by the end of the day. You owe this family. You have to save us." Chloe stood behind him, clutching her designer bag like a life preserver, nodding frantically, her mascara slightly smeared from crying. "You have to help us. Brianna, we are going to lose absolutely everything." I let out a soft, humorless laugh that made Marcus visibly flinch. "You already have," I replied smoothly. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick, red leather folder. I tossed it onto the polished surface. It slid perfectly to a stop right in front of my father's trembling hands. "Lumina Design Group is not just an architectural firm," I explained, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and steepling my fingers. "We also have a highly aggressive private equity division. 2 weeks ago, My acquisition team purchased several distressed debt portfolios from the secondary market, including, quite remarkably, a massive package of predatory, high-interest loans previously held by a certain unsavory syndicate. Marcus opened the folder with shaking hands. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fresh corpse. He was staring directly at the original promissory notes he had signed, the very documents tying his sprawling Gold Coast estate to the criminal underworld. Only now, my corporate seal was stamped in bright red ink over the creditor line. "I am not your obedient little bank," I told them, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute whisper. "I am your primary debt holder. You are currently in default to the tune of $8 million. And unlike the syndicate, I do not send thugs to break your legs. I simply take your houses." Eleanor let out a sharp, horrified gasp, bringing both hands up to cover her mouth as her knees buckled slightly. Chloe began to openly sob, the brutal reality of her impending poverty finally breaking her fragile, narcissistic psyche. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your clothes and vacate the property," I stated, looking my father dead in his terrified eyes, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "If you are still inside that house at noon tomorrow, my legal team will initiate a ruthless, highly public foreclosure. I will have the county sheriff drag you out onto the street in front of all your wealthy country club friends, and I will make absolutely sure the local news cameras are there to document every single humiliating second of it." Marcus tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. They were utterly powerless, stripped of their fake wealth and their unearned arrogance. They stood trapped in the towering fortress of the daughter they had so casually thrown away, finally realizing that I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand, and I was about to crush it. Despite my explicit eviction notice, my family possessed a toxic, almost psychotic delusion regarding their social standing. Instead of packing their bags, Marcus and Eleanor decided to burn the very last fragments of their maxed-out credit lines on one final, desperate grift. If Derek was bankrupt and their estate was gone, their only remaining lifeline was to quickly secure a new host for their parasitic lifestyle. And so, they hosted a lavish, over-the-top baby shower gala in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. It was a spectacular theater of lies. The crystal chandeliers gleamed, towering floral arrangements choked the tables, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Chloe, draped in a custom maternity gown, was already circling the room, aggressively fluttering her eyelashes at a recently divorced hedge fund manager. They were racing against the clock, praying to trap a new wealthy bachelor before my foreclosure notice hit the public county records the very next morning. They never expected me to attend, but you do not engineer a demolition without staying to watch the building fall. I arrived completely uninvited. I stepped through the gilded double doors of the ballroom, wearing a stunning backless emerald designer gown that dragged elegantly across the polished marble floor. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me with a resounding thud. The string quartet missed a note. Conversations abruptly died out, spreading across the room like a sudden frost. The high society guests, many of whom had heard the whispered rumors of my divorce, turned to stare. I did not shrink under their gaze. I radiated an untouchable, lethal grace as I walked directly toward the center of the room, parting the sea of wealthy socialites like royalty. Marcus and Eleanor saw me approaching. Their faces turned the color of ash. Chloe froze mid-laugh, her champagne glass trembling in her manicured hand. The wealthy bachelor she was targeting took a bewildered step back, sensing the immediate, suffocating shift in the atmosphere. I stopped precisely 2 feet away from my sister. I offered her a serene, perfectly practiced smile, completely devoid of any warmth. "Hello, Chloe?" I said, my voice carrying clearly through the dead silence of the grand ballroom. "I could not possibly miss the celebration of your new family. I brought you a gift." I extended my hands. I held a beautifully wrapped silver box tied with a thick silk ribbon. Chloe stared at it as if I were handing her a live explosive. Her breathing grew shallow, but with hundreds of elite eyes watching her every move, she had no choice but to maintain her delicate facade. She forced a trembling smile and accepted the box, pulling the silk ribbon loose. She opened the lid, There were no baby clothes inside. There were no diamond rattles or imported toys. Inside the box was a neat stack of legal documents. I had placed the federal environmental bankruptcy filings for Derek right on top, complete with the massive, multi-million-dollar penalty highlighting his total ruin. Beneath that lay the stamped, official public foreclosure notices for our parents' Gold Coast estate, effectively proving they were entirely destitute. But the crowning jewel, resting at the very bottom of the box, was a certified medical paternity test. Chloe lifted the top page, her eyes scanning the bold legal print. A strangled, panicked gasp escaped her throat. She desperately tried to shove the papers back into the box, but her hands were shaking so violently that the folder slipped. The documents cascaded out, scattering across the polished marble floor for every wealthy guest to see. Before my parents could scramble to pick up the damning evidence, a violent commotion erupted at the back of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors flew open with a tremendous crash, bouncing off the walls. A man stormed into the gala, reeking of cheap cologne and stale alcohol. He was a broke, sleazy nightclub promoter known around the downtown circuit for his aggressive debts. He was certainly not dressed for a high society baby shower, wearing a wrinkled leather jacket and a stained designer shirt. "Where is my money? Chloe?" the man roared, storming past the terrified waiters. "You promised me a $50,000 payout for keeping my mouth shut about the timeline. Your little tech bro husband is bankrupt. His phone is disconnected, and I am not taking the fall for these kids without getting my cut." The entire ballroom erupted into chaotic, deafening gasps. The wealthy hedge fund manager Chloe had spent the last 2 hours meticulously flirting with looked at her in absolute, unadulterated disgust. He realized instantly that he was just her next designated victim. Without saying a single word, he turned on his heel and marched out of the ballroom. That was the signal. The grand, carefully constructed facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The judgment of high society is swift and utterly merciless. Whispers turned into loud, open scoffs of revulsion. One by one, the wealthy guests set down their champagne glasses, grabbed their coats, and headed for the exits. The exodus was rapid and brutal. Marcus and Eleanor fell to their knees on the marble floor, frantically trying to gather the scattered foreclosure notices, weeping openly as their entire social world evaporated around them. Chloe collapsed into a chair, wailing as the nightclub promoter continued to shout demands at her. Demanding money she completely lacked. I stood in the center of the ruins, untouched by the chaos, watching the structural collapse of the people who had tried to bury me. They were entirely ruined, publicly humiliated, and utterly alone in a massive, empty ballroom they could not even afford to rent. My work was officially finished. Exactly 1 year later, the air was crisp and clear. I stood on the sprawling, sunlit private terrace of Lumina Design Group, gently swirling a warm cup of imported espresso. The morning breeze caught my hair as I looked out over the vibrant, towering Chicago skyline. 3 massive cranes were currently erecting the steel framework for a beautiful, sustainable civic center my firm had won the contract to build. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from a brilliant, supportive colleague, inviting me to a celebratory lunch for our latest architectural award. I smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached my eyes. Derek was currently facing federal prison time for attempting to hide assets from the Environmental Agency. My parents were living in a cramped, 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, completely ostracized from polite society, and Chloe was tied to a man who possessed nothing but debts and a terrible temper. But I did not waste my time thinking about them anymore. I took a slow sip of my espresso, signing in the profound peace of the morning. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my life. True power is not just about ruthlessly destroying those who betrayed you. It is about building a beautiful, unshakable life that they can never, ever touch again. Hello again. Dear listeners, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for staying until the very end and listening to Brianna's incredible journey. I would love to know, where are you currently listening to this story from? Please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and satisfying, I have a massive favor to ask. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is unfortunately losing its monetization, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and must transition our entire operation to Patreon. Please help us keep these stories alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our absolute best, exclusive, true, and significantly longer stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can easily join us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the direct Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you for your endless support, and I cannot wait to share our next grand adventure with you over on Patreon.